Well, thank you very much. Let me make sure I actually click the right button. Want to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands on which we meet today, as well as on which my company is based. Also want to say thank you to Jack Collins, who's a PhD candidate at the University of Mannheim, who has a real interest in propensity scores on probability-based online panels, and has been kind enough to talk some of this through with us. I'm going to, in the interest of time, just move along fairly quickly. My use of generative AI tends to be PowerPoint illustrations. Anna's basically talked through much of life in Australia's functioning as of yesterday. I think the key thing for us is, we've evolved from the kind of a much simpler one wave a month. Everybody gets invited to that survey, one survey a wave, everybody gets invited to that survey, to much more complicated operations as the panel has grown and matured, which means there's a lot more thinking to be done in terms of panel management. I think that's I'm good with that. Essential problem is, in many ways, we are trying to predict the future, which is a business I never, ever wanted to be in. I'm going to call this commercial panel management, because this is a commercial panel, but I suspect some of it might apply to academic or nonprofits as well. But that's not a sandpit I play in. So I'm going to frame it as commercial. So the essential problem for me is that clients, not unreasonably, want the sample achieved to be at least as large as their target population. The problem for me, as somebody running a panel, is that while exceeding the target sample size may make the client very, very happy, it's going to incur unbudgeted costs. Yes, I could build in buffer to cover that, but then we're going to have cost competitiveness problems, which is problematic, as we kind of discussed in the panel yesterday. So basically, we've got to predict the future fairly accurately. There's limited options for that, and if anybody is a working crystal ball, talk to me afterwards. So one of the options is, we invite a surplus of panelists. Once we hit quota, we'll cut it off. Problem with that is, our panelists are probably not going to be like being invited to a survey to be told, oh, I'm sorry, it's closed. And also, we know, all of us, that the early respondents are not like the late respondents, so we are going to probably have problems with respect to sample composition. So that's probably not a great solution for the most part. So we could invite just enough panelists, and then if we need to, throw more sample on right at the end, close to end of field. So that's probably, again, going to have sample composition, and it's going to also increase operational complexity, because it does have wear and tear on people. And again, it's probably not a great thing if you're a panelist invited late to be told, there's a survey of it, oh, I'm sorry, it's closed. So where we've come around, in the title, I've called it adaptive. It's not really it's adaptive in a minor sense, I suppose, to invite slightly more panelists than we think we need, and then to kind of get in as close to sort of land the plane nicely, close to the target sample size, is to manipulate contact attempts right at end of field, in an effort to come in as close as possible. So central to all this is the propensity score. This is not news. Our moderator and David, so Peck and David have both talked through this at their April webinar a couple of years back. So in my case, got 3 uses for the propensity score, I should say, not counting its use in weighting. So kind of well ahead of field when, we get a request for proposals or a request for quote for some arbitrary population at some arbitrary point in the future with some certain set of survey characteristics, primarily the length of it. And we need to estimate, can we achieve that sample purely with our panel, or do we need to look at alternatives like a blended sample? We also need for figuring out how many invitations to send. And finally, the way we manage it, we also need to have a good sense of where we're going to end up as we go through field. So our approach, and you'll see very soon that this has been become quite problematic for us, has been what we call the conditional day model. So we've got a group of 15 models. They correspond, the first one corresponds to, we have no information about how the survey is performing. So that's the 0-day model prior to field. And then as we go through field. So the rationale is, of course, as we go through field, the longer a case takes and does not respond, that really ought to be reflected in their estimated response propensity. I'm not going to belabor the features of the model. They are fairly probably standard for those of you who run panels and do similar things. And then as for the days 1 through 14, we also build in the survey level completion rate as a feature. And I should say the model's retrained every 2 weeks. So in terms of model development, which mean my statistician colleagues, tested a variety of approaches, including tree and regression-based. The tree-based approaches outperformed the regression models. We ended up going with random forests over XGBoost, even though XGBoost performed a little bit better because it was being a bit simpler and, broadly speaking, more tractable. So the essential challenge is the model has been fairly pervasively under-predicting completion rates. I don't have a cut, and so I should have said that those were, by the way, individual surveys that we've fielded across September through January. So I don't have a smoking gun, but the most likely candidate, I think, by far, is we've created an unfortunate feedback loop between our predictions and the model. So when we underestimate propensity, we draw too much sample, which means we've got to intervene in field by dialing back the contact attempts. Basically, we are forcing our actual completion rate to reach our model, to meet our modeled completion rate. And so we're basically training it to expect an intervention. There are other possibilities, so potentially some aggregation effects. So the model is optimized for predicting individual response propensities, not a group. I do suspect some of the assumptions for independent and additiveness hold. Abnormalities may be an issue because, of course, it is a bimodal distribution, and most people, they're either responding or they're not. So the modes are close to 0 and 1. And potentially, again, we may be under-specializing with our models. So what makes a good day 0 model may not make for a good day 13 model. And yes, potentially there's model misspecification, although that is almost every model ever. So adjustments. So one thing, we are streamlining things. Thank you. So instead of a kitchen sink, sort of trying to remove features that are probably not contributing too much to it. Excluding surveys that are problematic in the sense it's a very unusual population or some other unusual element in the way it was fielded that may not be very useful as training data, and potentially excluding predictors with large amounts of missing data. So this slightly improves matters, but it's nowhere near enough. So this is still work in progress, unfortunately, but looking to, instead of, say, what's the likelihood of what's the propensity to response for this case on this day, to change it to after this number of reminders. So it should be ideally more flexibly able to accommodate our pattern of intervening in fieldwork. Now, of course, we will yet to see whether this translates to reality. So the other things, and just kind of status on them, this is very much work in progress. So potentially, as I said, removing unusual surveys from the training data. We've got, as we go through, sort of looking at the performance of the various models as we do our usual work on the panel. changing the imputation approach, so not re-imputing every time, but using our standard imputations. We use panel weighting, adding a few additional features, and the one which I'm quite excited to see trialled is adding a weighting function so that we will weight more recent surveys more heavily. So I guess for takeaways, so yes, this is very much a work in progress. I would say the first suggestion is don't do what we do. The combination of the propensity models we use with adaptive fieldwork, it worked okay at the beginning, but it's clearly the model, it's a smart little devil, and it's learnt. Very happy to hear thoughts and suggestions over at coffee break. Thank you.
Right, that's a good time